This past week, we had .NET Conf 2020, which was a 3-day conference unveiling the new .NET 5, C# 9, and the changes in Visual Studio that came recently, most specifically 16.8 version of 2019. So I want to take some time in this video to talk about those changes, those improvements, and how we can think about them in a larger picture. Now, if you don't know me, my name is Tim Corey, and my goal is to make learning C# easier. And one of the ways I do that is by teaching context, teaching real world, not just cool new things in a vacuum. And that's what we're going to do in this video. Is we're going to talk about how these new things affect you and how you should look at implementing them in the real world if you should. So what we're going to do in this video is I'm going to introduce you and kind of talk at a high level about the things that went on in the conference. And then I'm going to go over the next 6 videos I'm going to release on these different topics, because I want to dive deep into 6 different areas that we talked about. So we'll cover that near the end. But first, let's talk about the new things at a high level. And one of the first things that came out of this conference was that Grpc. And if you're not familiar with Grpc, I've got a video intro to Grpc on this channel that talks about it. It's a way of communicating between a client and a server in a way that is much more efficient than, say, an API. Well, Grpc has had some huge performance increases. And I'm not going to go deep into it because I'm not going to do perf. If you want to look at perf, you can look at the docs site, but they have improved the speed over, say, C++, I believe, Go, and Java's implementation of Grpc. Grpc is an open standard, so there's all these different languages that use it. And so if you want performant Grpc, you can use, and you probably should use, C#. So that's some really good news on that front. Xamarin Forms 5, there's some cool changes in Xamarin Forms, some ways to improve that. And that really kind of leads into the .NET 5 changes, which are really preparation for .NET 6. I know it sounds weird that a whole version is dedicated to kind of preparation or anticipation of the next version. But the reason we did this, or they did this, is because the changes in our culture, the changes in work from home, and all the things that have gone on over 2020 have kind of slowed the process down. And the merging of all the .NETs together, whether that be Xamarin or .NET Core or UWP, and all the rest of a .NET, not the framework, not .NET framework, but all the rest merging together into one language, well, that comes in really C# 6, or .NET 6, I'm sorry, .NET 6, and that comes out next year. But that's kind of the framework for that. And in .NET, in .NET 6, yes, .NET 6, C# 9. Confusing? No. In .NET 5 and then in 6, what's going to happen is that we're going to have cross-platform, basically everything. Forms, like Windows Forms, and we're going to have web, which you already have. We're going to have console. Basically, all the platforms will be all cross-platform. So when you write C# code, you can write for any platform, which right now we're kind of missing the desktop side of that. And that's where .NET 6 comes in. So .NET 5 is kind of the preparation for that. And that's where the improvements to Xamarin Forms are really important, because that's kind of the foundation in which .NET 6 is built upon. So there's some really cool stuff going on there. Another thing that I thought was really cool, I'm still keeping an eager eye on, is Project Ty. And it's an experimental project that's not yet ready for prime time production, but it's definitely ready for trying out and seeing how it works. And that is a project that's all about microservices. And right now with microservices, especially when you talk about Kubernetes and having multiple microservices talk to each other and all the stuff that goes along with that, it can be quite overwhelming. And that's where Project Ty aims to make a lot of that ceremony go away and make it so that we can just kind of more easily spin up a whole environment with all these different moving pieces without having to go into real depth when it comes to Kubernetes. So some really cool things there. Like I said, We're not going to cover it in depth yet because I wanted to get a little further down the road before we start investing in it and start learning it, because I think that it will be a really valuable tool, but not quite yet because it's definitely not production ready. It's development kind of ready, but if you can't rely on it for production, then that's a whole nother thing you have to learn and kind of you have to jump off the cliff sometime. So I want to wait until that's an easier, more gradual process rather than a cliff at some point. So that's coming along. Another thing that came out of the conference is in Visual Studio 2019 version 16.8. So in that version, there's a lot of Git improvements in how we interact with Git, and the things that are done there, it really a lot improved. So some really cool stuff going on there. There's a new Azure Sdk setup for really easy working with, making it easy to work with Azure in a way that's really easy to do in C#. So that's really helpful. And there's a lot of other stuff going on, but let's talk about, and those kind of high level things, but let's talk about the 6 things that I want to go deeper in. So those previous things, there's cool stuff going on there, and there's even more machine learning and other things. But I think there's 6 areas that came out of this conference for me that I said, yes, I want to go deeper into that. So the first one, and it's not necessarily the first one I'll release. In fact, probably the second video I release, but it will be on records. So this is one of those things that's come out. That's kind of the big thing about C# 9. And that is records. And records are kind of like classes with extra stuff. They are more like value types rather than reference types. And if you don't know what that means, basically when we have, let's say, an int value. So you have a number and the value is 4. When you create a new variable, let's say, int b, and so you have int a with a value of 4, you create int b and say, b equals a, you're copying the value. It is a value type. And so you copy that value from a and put it into b. So if you change b after the fact, you don't change a as well, because you made a copy of it. That's a value type. Well, records are kind of like that, but for models, for having multiple properties in them. So you can copy them, and what it does is it makes a shallow copy of that class. Now, there's a lot to get into there. In some ways, they've been a little overhyped, I think, because they're not quite as useful as it sounds. There's a lot of good stuff that comes out of them, but they're not quite as useful as it sounds. So we're going to talk about, yes, they are useful. Yes, they have value, and there's a reason to use them, but it's maybe not nearly as big as what you've heard. And so there's a lot of gotchas around when you shouldn't use them. So we're going to have a whole video dedicated just to records in C# 9, because that's very important. But then there's 5 other features of C# 9 that I want to cover that aren't records. So that's probably the first video we cover, because there's some really cool, really quick things to cover, with things like init setters. So when you have a property, you have a set, you can make it read-only or private set, but there's a new way of setting it up called init. And we'll talk about that and how that's really valuable in a lot of ways. We'll look at some new pattern matching stuff that's really neat. And my favorite pattern match, which doesn't have anything to do with switch statements really. Patterns are usually in switch statements, but this pattern is one I've been waiting for forever. So we're going to talk about that in the 5 new features in C# that aren't records. Now, the third video, so that the records was actually the second video. The first video was the 5 other things in C# 9. The third video, we're going to talk about desktop development, and that's the improvements in .NET 5 and Visual Studio 2019 16.8. I referenced that specific version number because that's the one that was released recently. There's already a preview of 16.9 that's out, and they'll have some cool new things in that. But 16.8 was the release for .NET 5 and for C# 9. So we're going to talk about that version, which is the one that's out right now. So in the desktop development improvement area, we're going to talk about things like XAML hot reload and design time binding and the new Windows Form Designer or the improved Windows Form Designer. And then the big one we're going to cover in this video is click once. It's back. It's better than ever. And so we're going to talk about that and how to use it when it's appropriate. You see me cover Squirrel, which is another a click once alternative that works with a lot of .NET Framework, .NET Core, and we've talked about MSIX, which is the other side with kind of the UWP route, but it still works for WPF and WinForms. But now we're looking at click once. You'll have options out of the box, and so we're going to look at those options and how they work. Now, the next video number 4, we're going to cover the new API changes. There's some really cool things around APIs that are coming out. The biggest one is the built-in open API, which is also known as Swagger. So we've used Swagger before in my courses, like in the Timco Retail Manager series. We implemented Swagger, and to be honest, it's a bit of a pain because of all the configuration. You will love how easy Swagger is. But Swagger is not just about having this cool page where you can see your API. We're going to actually build automatically a C# client to talk to our API based upon that Swagger UI. So we're going to do that. We're going to do some other really cool things around that Swagger, setting it up, configuring it, using it, and just seeing how the API is different now in .NET 5. The next video number 5, we're going to talk about HTTP Repl, REPL. Now, if you've never heard of HTTP Repl, what it is a tool for testing your API easily. And there's been some changes recently that have made it even better. And so we're going to integrate it right into Visual Studio. And this tool is it almost acts like a command prompt for your API, where you can do things like dir to read all the different commands you can call against your API. And then you can dial in to the correct directory, which is actually just going to be whatever command you want to call. And you can do get and post and put and all those commands right on the command line very, very quickly and easily to test your API. And so we'll see how to do that and how easy it is, which it doesn't replace Postman, but it doesn't require the complexities of Postman either. And so there's a lot of very quick and easy ways to test your API using HTTP Repl that you don't have to get Postman out to do. So we'll talk about that in video 5. Video 6 is all about Blazor. And I'm sure that you've got a lot of questions. You've probably heard a lot of cool stuff around Blazor that have happened recently, and there's a lot. So we're going to talk about that in video 6. If we can cram it all into one video, we might have to make 2 videos out of it. So there's CSS Isolation. That's a big one that people have been asking for. It's in the new .NET 5 version. There's new file types like the input file and the input radio. There's huge performance improvements. For example, if you brought down 1,000 records or wanted to display 1,000 records in a table or a view on your Blazor page, I recommend against it because of the fact that your user doesn't need to see all 1,000 records. But before it happened is you bring all 1,000 records on, bind the whole thing. Well, now with the new virtualized keyword, we can bind just the ones that are visible. And it can actually call out to an API to get the next few records it needs as it needs them to be very, very efficient. And so we'll talk about that. We'll talk about optional and catch-all routes and a lot of other cool stuff, including the performance improvements of Blazor WebAssembly as well. So lots of cool stuff coming up. Like I said, there's 6 videos coming out at least on these new things. I want to make this video kind of give an overview of what's going on, but also let you know that I'm not going to wait for the weekly cadence that we have of every Monday releasing a video because there's just too much stuff. At this point, I wouldn't be done until January, showing you all the cool stuff that's going on. I don't want you to wait that long. So I'm going to be increasing my cadence with these videos. I'm not going to do it permanently just for these videos. I still want to also get to the Timco Retail Manager series and kind of wrap up phase 2 and prepare for phase 3. Yes, we're going to do a phase 3 with the Timco Retail Manager, some really cool stuff coming up there as well. So there's a lot to cover, a lot to go over. Going to be a lot of videos coming out shortly. Hopefully you got some time over, if you have Thanksgiving break in the US or Christmas break or just some time off, hopefully you can get caught up in all these cool things coming out. I would encourage you, if you're not already subscribed and have that notification turned on, do that so you're alerted, because it's not just every Monday and Thursday like normal, but there'll be videos probably on Wednesdays and Fridays as well. And that all depends on my schedule. I'm going to try and get them as fast as possible because I want these in your hands so you can make decisions based upon the new stuff coming out. Now, you may be in the place where you're saying, yeah, .NET 5 is already out. I just started thinking about .NET Core. We're on .NET Framework, and that's just too much stuff too fast. The way Microsoft is doing it is that every other major release from now on will be a long-term support release. And I believe that's 3 years. Don't quote me on that one. I think you have to look it up. I think it's 3 years of support for that release. .NET 5 is not one of those releases. .NET 6 is. So every even number, in theory from now until eternity, but we'll see how it goes. For every even number, that will be a long-term release, meaning a long-term support. Every release, every number will come out in November of the next year. So .NET 5 is out in November of 2020. .NET 6, in theory, comes out in November 2021. You can do the math after that. .NET 7, 2022, .NET 8, 2023, and so on. So that's the plan. So that's one thing. That's the cadence going forward for the major releases. And then also these are more upgrades than they are massive redos. .NET Core was a massive redo. .NET 5 is not necessarily it's not a massive redo from .NET Core. So .NET Core 3.1 to .NET 5 is not a major upgrade. At least it's not as far as changes go. As far as improvements go, yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff, a lot of speed improvements, a lot of overall making things better. But when it comes to the pain of the upgrade cycle, it's not nearly as bad as it was to go from .NET Framework, which is essentially a whole different framework than .NET Core. That upgrade was a little more difficult. But I will be doing videos on upgrading to .NET 5. We'll take the Timco Retail Manager applications through an upgrade to .NET 5 at some point, not until phase 3. But that's coming soon. That's coming probably in January. But we'll go through all that. We'll walk you through the process. But if you're not yet in .NET Core, I'd highly encourage you to get to it. If you can, go straight to .NET 5. You're going to have to do some work to make sure that your stuff will take that leap, but it's worth the leap because this is going to keep snowballing and improving and improving and improving. And you want those improvements. You want that security improvement. You want those efficiency improvements, and the new features and new language are really going to benefit your application. Now, on the other side, if you have an established .NET Framework app, it will be .NET Framework is supported as long as Windows is supported. So you don't have to move. You can stay right where you're at. You're fine. Your app will continue to run. The only downside is that you may not get any new updates. So I heard this recently, the conversation, I believe it's on Twitter, where people go back and forth on, well, this is a bad thing. Because it was a conversation, I believe, on upgrading Dapper and the idea that Dapper is going to be upgrading to .NET 5 soon. And the conversation goes around, well, what about .NET Framework? And they're like, that version is not going to be upgraded. It's not going to support .NET Framework anymore. And that's scary and concerning. But the reality is what you had, that version of Dapper that works with .NET Framework, still works. it still works just fine. It's just that all new changes, all new features, they come in the new version with taking advantage of the new language features, taking advantage of the new framework features. And so if you want new stuff, you have to upgrade. If you don't mind staying at one level and not getting new stuff, you're fine in the .NET framework. So there's that balance there. Don't get overly excited either way. Figure out what you need to do to have the best long-term success for your product, for your company, and for your situation. Okay, so that's what's coming up. There's new stuff for .NET 5. There's new stuff for Visual Studio. There's new stuff for C#. I encourage you to get out there and try it out. Go read some documentation. docs.microsoft.com has some really good stuff on the newest stuff. But also stay tuned to this channel. There's gonna be a lot of videos coming out soon. Practice what you see. Don't just decide to use that stuff. Make sure you listen to what we talk about when we talk about the when to implement, because there are some gotchas in here. I'll make sure that you've got them. Okay, so that's it for this video. New videos coming out very, very soon on all this new stuff. I look forward to seeing you then. And as always, I am Tim Corey.